Venus and star blessings. Welcome back, guys. So I just wanted to share a few thoughts on Saturn in Pisces from the point of view of midpoints as well. I wrote something yesterday on the community section and on Facebook, and it seems that quite a few people related to it, which I'm not surprised at all. I was just thinking about I was thinking about why this energy has felt so heavy for me since Sinead O'Connor's transition, actually. It's been a very heavy emotional energy for me, very deep, very complex, very, very heavy. And I thought something as heavy as this, which was impacting me really 24/7 with a really heavy heart. And it's been really challenging, actually, and really just interfering just with my everyday movements, my sleep cycles, with everything. And so that's when I thought to myself yesterday, okay, Saturn's got to be doing something to my chart, because it's just felt like a really heavy dose of Saturn. And so I thought, okay, well, what's 5 degrees of Pisces? Where is that in my chart, right? And so I looked to see where 5 degrees of Pisces sits in my own chart, and it just so happened that Saturn at the moment at 5 degrees happens to be right at a midpoint between my moon and Pluto. And in midpoint astrology, which is called cosmobiology, a very important area of astrology that doesn't get a lot of focus at all, actually, in mainstream astrology, but it is something that I studied many, many years ago, a couple of decades ago, when I first started studying astrology. So I've always been very, very aware of the power of midpoints. It's an area that you could say is specialized. And it's an area that you just can't see it by looking at the chart, just by visually looking at this chart that you see on the screen right now, unless you are extremely technically minded and have been working, with astrology for a long time, let's say, and you have a really good eye for detail and a good eye for spotting things that are not immediately obvious. Or if you don't work with midpoints, you will just overlook these things. They just won't come into your field of awareness, because a midpoint is something that it's not immediately obvious, and it's something that you kind of need to investigate and look for. For example, in this chart, if you wanted to look at the midpoint between Sun and Neptune, would your mind be able to calculate that on the spot? You may be able to. You may have one of those minds that's just very, good with maths and things like that. Of course, the beauty of this program, and perhaps many others as well, it has a section here which is called midpoint listing. And so, for example, I just said, what would be the midpoint of Sun Neptune? Well, here it is. Here it shows me it's 4 degrees of Gemini. That's just one example. There's all these examples here. So these are all the midpoints between all the variations of planets in this chart, for instance, right? So that's basically how you determine it. Also, if you scroll down, if you're working with solar fire, you'll see then you have midpoints from the point of view of the zodiac, from 0 Aries right through to the end of Pisces, right? So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can look at the combination of planets, or you can look at the degrees of the zodiac. So if you wanted to say, look at what's happening at 7 degrees of Aries in this chart. Well, 7 degrees of Aries is the midpoint of the moon and the North Node, right? It's just another example. So anyway, as I said, I had a look and I saw that Saturn was really hitting something quite heavy in my own chart. Moon, Pluto, Saturn. When you look at Reinhold Urbiton's Cosmobiology book, which is a book on the interpretation of all the various midpoints that can occur between planets and points in the chart. And I said this in what I wrote, and that is that everything he writes in that book is more or less very bleak, right? It's it comes from a time where life was a bit bleak, difficult times. I think he was of German descent, from a particular generation and so forth. So, I mean, he understood astrology really well, and his interpretations, whilst they may be bleak, they're actually incredibly accurate, sometimes in such an eerie way, actually. So when I looked at the meaning of Saturn being at the midpoint of Moon, Pluto in my own chart, here's what it said. It said, a one-sided emotional life, grave inhibitions, and inclination to depressions, mental and emotional suffering. So that's, he'll just give, like, usually he'll just give a sentence or a line to the meaning of a midpoint. In this case, Saturn. So what does it mean to have Saturn at the midpoint of Moon, Pluto? Now, this could be a midpoint that you have in your chart. I'm talking about a transiting midpoint at the moment in my own chart, right? So I'm talking about wherever Pluto and the Moon are in my chart at the moment via the transit of Saturn. Saturn is at that exact midpoint of my position of my Moon and Pluto. So it's activating that energy between Pluto and the Moon. Saturn is activating that energy. Now, Saturn is a malefic planet. It's not an easy energy. And Pluto, for that matter, it's not a malefic planet, but it is a very intense and difficult energy when we are talking about the lunar goddess. And Saturn is also a very difficult energy for the lunar goddess. Both Saturn and Pluto threaten the Moon's security. No questions asked. So there can be, you know, a lot of internal pain, very difficult emotional processes that could be activated by Saturn hitting off the midpoint of Moon, Pluto in your chart. As I said, you could have this as a natal signature in your chart. That is that the position of the Moon, Saturn, and Pluto in your chart, or more specifically, the position of Pluto and the Moon in your chart, Saturn happens to be right at the midpoint between the two, for instance. So the description that I read would therefore be a life theme, right, in certain ways for you. It doesn't mean that you're doomed and that, you know, you will feel like that every single day, right? Because there are things like evolution, there are things like healing, there are things like working through things consciously and so forth. So, you know, do we transcend everything in the chart? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do believe that the more conscious we become and the more we stay aligned with our script is our dharma. The script is the chart. That's our dharma. That's what we are here to do, to experience, to manifest, to evolve through, to understand. And as we bring more awareness and consciousness to the understanding of our script, we tend to bring less resistance to the script. It's resistance that makes things a lot more difficult for us, because the resistance brings up the sense of feeling unsatisfied or victimized, or unhappy, you know, or suppressing something that's inherently there for you to actually work on and work through, and so forth. I also wrote this little quote that I just would like to read. which I think is just really beautiful. The darkest nights produce the brightest stars. I don't know where that comes from, but I just had it written down somewhere. So I just posted it yesterday with a picture of this just beautiful diamond-like star in the sky, because I thought to myself, it's so true. You know, when we are going through some very deep emotional processes and journeys that are really, they feel like the dark night of the soul, just to use another expression. The dark night of the soul is never one night. You know, for some people it's years, for some people it's weeks, for some people it's months, sometimes it's just days, but it's a really intense experience, and it's unique and different for each of us, right? But it is through those darker emotional processes where we can access deeper healing, deeper insight, and deeper understanding. And it's where we are, I think, incredibly tested with our resilience, and really tested to remember our essence and who we are, and that the script and the storyline and the appearances on the exterior are not who we are, but our stories that we navigate through, that we need to understand, that we need to resolve and rise above, right? So the first thing as well that I want to talk about here is that with transiting Saturn in Pisces, there's a few things going on. If you are older than 29, then it's really worth considering, you know, Saturn in Pisces is a culmination, right? It's a cycle where Saturn is completing its journey in the entire zodiac, as it were. It's at the last sign, at the end of the wheel. So it's a culmination, it's a closing, finishing process. And indeed, very difficult. You know, it's a little bit like the balsamic energy of the dark phase of the moon. That balsamic phase of the moon is very much a 12th house Pisces experience. And when you put Saturn into that, it surely can't be easy, because it is the death of a lot of different things. It could be the death of dreams that you had, you know. It's the ultimate test to surrendering. Surrender is Pisces, 12th house Neptune. And Saturn would, you know, does struggle in Pisces, because Saturn is very, very connected to this third dimension reality. It is all about form and structure. It is about creating. It is about working hard. It is about focus and so forth. And Pisces is the complete opposite to that. It's fluid. It's a water sign. It's mutable. It's feminine. It's spirit. It's imagination. It's dreams. It's formless. It's really the antithesis to Saturn. So, you know, we are really greatly challenged to some extent to realize that there are a lot of things coming to an end and to a closure for all of us and for the collective. And I guess the key to working with this energy is the ability to trust and surrender into the letting go process, right? And that we absolutely cannot control most things, as a matter of fact, let alone everything. We just simply cannot control so much of what goes on out there. And I think Saturn in Pisces really teaches us that lesson, that we can't control everything, that things do dissolve, that we try to hold on to a perspective, a reality, a thing, whatever it is, and that we simply cannot. We have to let things end and finish. So it's a really hard lesson, a really hard journey with Saturn in Pisces. You know, if we could find a more positive outlook on that, we could say that, well, yes, on the one hand, it is the process of things finishing and completing, and some things coming to a complete end. And on the other hand, it's also about becoming realistic about our dreams and the perspective we have on reality, to become more grounded in our reality and our conscious construct of reality, which is Saturn. So we have all those kinds of themes there with Saturn in Pisces. We have the fact that it's at the end of the wheel. We have the matter of Saturn passing through a particular house in our birth chart, for the next 2.5 years or so. And then we have the matter of, well, is Saturn passing over any planets in our birth chart? So do we have planets in Pisces that Saturn will pass over? We also have the matter of, do we have planets in Virgo? Saturn will make an opposition to our planets in Virgo. In some cases, both in the conjunction and opposition. It might be one pass, it might be 3 passes. That's something that you need to figure out, obviously. And that's due to Saturn's retrograde movement, right? Then, of course, there are planets that you could have in Gemini and Sagittarius. So Saturn will be forming a square, right, to your planets in Sag and Gemini. All these aspects, conjunction, opposition, and square, well, they are the major aspects, really, and they're all potent and challenging because it's Saturn. It is a malefic planet. See, Saturn is the greatest teacher. There's no two ways about it, but it is an energy that is very difficult learning. It's very difficult lessons. They don't come easily. And Saturn is not an energy where we feel supported. It's an energy where we feel like we're doing it hard and we might be doing it alone, and we simply have to find a way to contend with that and to integrate it and to work with it, as best we can. So we have all those levels. You also might have Saturn coming over your ascendant, if you had Pisces rising or any of the other angles. That's a really huge time in your life if you have Saturn passing over one of your angles, especially if it's coming to, well, all of the angles are super powerful. They just all have different themes and meanings. But if it's coming over your ascendant, that's a brand new cycle, even though it's finishing something in Pisces. So these nuances can become a little bit sort of more complicated in the interpretation and understanding, but it is these finer details that really help you personalize and define what this Saturn in Pisces journey means for you, right? What else? The other thing that, yeah. So I was looking at Saturn's movement, for the rest of this year and pretty much just about all of next year. And he's kind of out there on his own, as it were, right? He's not forming an aspect to Pluto. Pluto is going to go back into Aquarius next year and then back into Capricorn again. Saturn's not close enough to be conjunct Neptune, although it is conjunct by sign. It will form a sextile to Jupiter, and I'll get to that in a minute. But before I go there, there's something else I want to speak to. So relative to, let's say, the slower moving planets from Jupiter onwards, then those planets are not really having much of a relationship with Saturn while he's tracking these degrees of Pisces, except for when it gets to being sextile Jupiter, which, as I said, I'll get to that in a minute. But there's just one other thing I want to address relative to Saturn in Pisces and the early degrees of Pisces, there's something called decans in astrology, which is connected to the whole field of planetary rulerships, essential dignities, and debilities. So we have a system there that shows us when a planet is in its greatest strength or its so-called weakness. We have planets in a triplicity position. We have them in a bounds or terms position. Bounds and terms means the same thing. And then we have them in decans or faces. Again, that means the same thing, just two different words. And then we have them planets, that is, in a fall or detriment position, which is considered to be not a strong position for planets. It's far more complicated than that, and this is something I will actually be teaching in my classes coming up as well. Such an important component to your magic box, toolbox, of really understanding how planets work in different signs and why they work or don't work in the ways that they do at different points through the zodiac. So the first decan of Pisces actually belongs to Saturn itself. And so there's different schools of thought on that. You know, one might argue, well, perhaps that makes Saturn stronger because it's in its own position relative to it governing the first 10 degrees of Pisces. That could be true. On the other hand, we could also say, well, Saturn in the first decan of Pisces, if that is hitting off a midpoint in your chart, or if it's going over certain planets in your chart, because you have, you know, planets at the early degrees of Pisces, or you have the angles somewhere between 0 and 10 degrees of Pisces, then you're kind of getting a double dose of Saturn in Pisces, as it were. And Saturn is a heavy energy. We can't make it light and fluffy and happy-go-lucky. It's Saturn. It's just not the nature of, you know, Jupiter is happy-go-lucky. And as I like to say, Saturn, Capricorn energy can be unhappy, unlucky. I know that sounds a bit judgmental, but it's just a little joke that I have about the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. In any case, while Saturn is the greatest teacher, it is one of the heaviest energies in the chart. The good news is that the growth and lessons that can come out of the heaviness of Saturn can be, you know, lifelong anchors that can help you anchor solid growth and learning, right, in your life, and how you proceed forward, how you set things up, how you might change things completely because you've learned that, well, doing things in that particular way doesn't work, or whatever the case may be. And Saturn is the one that really encourages us. Well, it doesn't encourage us, it forces us to do the work. Jupiter encourages, and Saturn, you know, pulls out the stick and kind of beats you over the head, as it were, or on your back, and says, you know, you get on with it. You've got to do this work. You know, it's a hard slog. It's not easy, but you've got to do it. Whereas Jupiter would be the mentor, you know, the wise grandfather that you have in your life that gives you gold nuggets of wisdom and supports you and encourages you and uplifts you. Saturn doesn't do that. That's why we have to really learn to understand what Saturn is trying to teach us at any given point in our life, right? So anyway, again, I was just thinking, okay, so the first decan of Pisces is ruled by Saturn. So to me, that feels like it just makes that that first decan of Pisces harder to kind of work through. Not impossible, and maybe wonderful things can come out of that in terms of your own growth and learning. But, you know, just to go back to my example, at the moment, Saturn being at the midpoint of Pluto and Moon in my chart, you know, the Moon is just being hammered by Saturn and Pluto. Those two energies, like I said earlier, are very harsh energies for the Moon. You know, the Moon really just needs to feel a sense of safety and security. It's very easily threatened by the energies of Saturn and Pluto. So I guess, you know, for me, that's why this last week has felt incredibly heavy, really, 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 really heavy. So I wonder if any of you have something significant in the first 10 degrees of Pisces, because if you do, you'll be feeling, I suspect, this heavy dose of Saturn. And if you are out there and if you're hearing this and if you are feeling it, you know, please share in the comments. I'd just love to know how many people out there can relate to this and are experiencing it. And if you are, I can completely empathize with you. Unfortunately, it is unfortunate, but maybe it will turn into fortune down the track. What I'm getting at is that because Saturn is going retrograde and it goes right back to 0 degrees of Pisces, it means it's going to then go back over again, you know, the early degrees of Pisces. So in other words, the first decan of Pisces, Saturn will be hanging around that decan until around March next year. So we've got that to contend with to some extent. If it's, you know, something that is activating things in your chart and you're feeling this energy, it means that in various ways, you know, you will have to work with this energy until March. Of course, there are numerous other things going on in your life and in your chart that, you know, could, I don't know if counteract is the right word, but might bring in some different supports and things like that. It always depends on who you are, you know, what your soul is dealing with at any given moment. What are the rest of the transits going on in your chart? Where's this upcoming Venus star point taking place in your chart? You know, where's Pluto? There's so many things to consider always, right? But sometimes we are just more sensitive to certain degrees of the zodiac for different reasons. One example, which I'm giving today, is, you know, a midpoint example that would be go completely unnoticed if you don't work with midpoints, which is why I'm actually even doing this presentation today for people that are not aware of midpoints or hadn't considered the importance of them or didn't know how to work it out, how to work out midpoints. I just showed you through Solar Fire's program. But when we do this class in my course, we will actually look at many different elements connecting to midpoints and what are the sort of most potent midpoints to look for in your birth chart and why, and what do they represent and what do they mean and so forth. Because there's two layers to that. There's midpoints in your own chart that are super important, for instance, and then there's the journey of when you are tracking the transits that are going on at any given moment, you might not have a lot going on in the first quadrant of your birth chart, right, which is houses 1, 2, and 3. And you might think, well, you know, nothing's going on in house 1, 2, and 3. There's no planets passing through there. There's nothing opposite those houses. But yeah, I'm feeling some matters around house 2 or house 3 or house 1. I can't figure out why. Now, it might be due to any number of reasons, but one of those number of reasons could be midpoint factors, for example. There's so many things to consider, right, is what I'm getting at. So, and also this is what I wanted to say. When we are looking at the cycle of Saturn through Pisces, which is a 2.5-year period, generally speaking, so that's how long it will spend in one house in your chart. I think what can really feel like Saturn transits being either much more harsh or much more difficult, or not feeling as difficult for other people. And this comes down to something called sect, which is teachings in Hellenistic astrology. And it's got to do with whether you're a day birth or a night birth. And if you are a night birth, for instance, it is said that Saturn's going to be the more difficult planet for you. And if you are a day birth, it is Mars that will be the more difficult planet for you. This is an ancient system, and believe me, it works. That's one level. So if you're a night birth, Saturn transits can be more difficult. No two ways about it. If Saturn is angular in your chart, so if it's in house 1, 4, 7, or 10, then Saturn transits can be said to be, again, more difficult. Why? Because planets in angular houses have tremendous power, for better or for worse. Again, this is another class that I'll be teaching in my astrology course and classes coming up very soon. So if you really want to understand these principles and these dynamics, where it comes from, why this thought is there in the first place, and how does it work in the chart and so forth, then join my classes and you'll certainly learn all about it. So night birth means Saturn is more difficult for you, generally speaking. If Saturn is angular in your chart, Saturn transits can be more difficult. Those are two concepts to consider as well. And also just, is Saturn a prominent planet in your chart, period? Is it the L-Newton of your chart? Meaning the ruler of your chart, for instance, which makes Saturn transits so much more important, because your life is in a huge way very much defined by what you do with Saturn's energy, if Saturn is a ruler of your chart. In most cases, people who have, generally speaking, Aquarius or Capricorn rising, Saturn will generally be the L-Newton of the chart. Now, there are lots of other systems that connect with that as well, which I won't go into today, but they're just some extra things to consider. If Saturn is conjunct the sun or the moon in your chart, then Saturn is an energy that really is part of your psychology. It's part of the makeup of your life. It's so when Saturn moves through your chart, you really feel that vibration. You're hearing the echoes of Saturn's lessons, as it were, what is asking you to work through, and so forth. And psychologically and emotionally, that translates to, oh, here I go again. I have to work through this now. I have to work through that particular, like, it doesn't feel like it eases up, so to speak. So in March next year, however, Saturn will finally get out of the first decan of Pisces. And once it hits about, I think it happens when they're both at 12. Yeah. So when Saturn gets to about 12 of Pisces, which is after March next year, 2024, it's going to form a sextile to Jupiter. And I think that's going to be a relief point for a lot of people who may be challenged by Saturn's presence in the first decan of Pisces for the various reasons that I've just explained in the last half an hour. If indeed that is you, it may not be you, but it may be you. So when Saturn forms a sextile to Jupiter, there's two very powerful things about this that are very encouraging and very promising. And that is that one, or three things actually. One, it's forming a sextile to a benefic, which is Jupiter, and Jupiter is the greater benefic. Two, the sextile aspect is an aspect of opportunity. And three, Saturn and Jupiter are forming a sextile aspect with a reception because Saturn is in Jupiter's sign. So there's three very fortunate, uplifting, benefic components to this portal, this transit, which is a collective transit. And in your chart, wherever it's happening, that's where it can possibly bring up some benefits and opportunities for you. And it might be as simply as whatever you've been working on from the time Saturn entered Pisces, let's say, so earlier this year, to, you know, March next year. I think it's important to just stay as focused as you can with the utmost trust of what you can't control, and surrender into that. Now, those are just words that I said, right? To do those things is another thing. To say them is one thing, to do them is another thing. And that's up to each of us to work out how we're going to do that. The first point is to have an understanding and have an awareness of what's going on, which is why I do these videos to begin with, right? And so come March with the sextile there, it might just mean that the hard slog, if it's been a hard slog, or the sense of finding it hard to let go of certain things because, you know, it feels like a death, because it is a death. I think it's important to remember that with any death, which is an ending, what's followed immediately is a new beginning. And in fact, death and birth it's one coin, just different sides of the one coin, because those two experiences, they cannot be separated. They are side by side, as it were. So whilst on the one hand there can be this grief around letting go of what was, that could be certain aspects of your life, that could be a relationship, it could be a career, it could be any you know, lots of different things. It just depends on who you are and what's going on in your life. It could be that you're at a particular age where you know, the way you lived your life before it's just not possible to live life in that same way anymore, because, you know, you're older, your body can't take as much of those sorts of activities or those sorts of things. You know, and particularly for women who are going through, you know, menopause, which can start at, you know, various ages. Some women start menopause in their 30s, you know. It's more, it seems to be more common to start in late 40s, early 50s, but, you know, there are different women's bodies respond differently, right? So, and for women out there who have gone through this or who are going through this will understand what I'm saying, right? It's, you know, menopause is such a deeply complex journey in life and passage that has, you know, a spiritual, emotional, psychological, and physical component to it. And all all those levels are going through a death process, as it were. So it's a very, very deep passage in a woman's life that doesn't get nearly enough respect or attention or support or understanding, collectively speaking, except for the women going through it, who often suffer in silence and just ride the waves. You know, I've spoken to numerous women who have been through it, who are going through it, and who suffer in silence. You know, it's unfortunately in the Western very personality dominated world of consumerism and of just the external gratification of material things and achieving more and so on and so forth. There's very little honor and respect placed on the internal, interior, emotional passages and transformations and changes and journeys that both men and women can go through. Women go through it in a very distinctive way, specifically because of menopause, for instance. So that's just another level. And Saturn in Pisces, you know, could coincide with this journey in your life, you know, which is, you know, it's painful. It's hard and it's painful. It's a death, literally, right? So anyway, as I said, you know, Saturn's kind of doing his own thing until eventually he forms a sextile to Jupiter, which, you know, is a little while away, but it is encouraging and something to kind of look forward to. I would say, like I said a moment ago, whatever you are resolving and dissolving, Saturn in Pisces is dissolving a lot of things for us personally and collectively. The matter is to trust and surrender to that process, to trust spirit, to trust what is invisible, which is very difficult for a lot of people. And to know that, you know, there's rebirths that are just, you know, being prepared. They're like these seeds being put into the soil, right? Because Saturn will finish his journey in Pisces and he will begin a whole brand new journey, archetypally, at the beginning of the wheel, the beginning of the zodiac in Aries. So it's an inevitable sense of things ending for everyone in different ways. Some people are just feeling it a lot more than others, we could say. Okay, that's the main things that I wanted to share for this early evening, late afternoon for me. And I will be back with more very, very soon. If you've stayed all the way through and you are listening to me right now, again, if you're interested in joining my classes, I'm basically starting on the 25th of August, and they will run in 10-week blocks. So the first block starts on the 25th of August. It's 2 classes per month. If you want to know more about it, just send me an email and I'll send you the information. And I will see you guys soon. I will be doing a presentation with Ariel Gutman on the Leo Venus star point in a few days' time. And I also need to set up a time with Rumen to also talk about Venus, but from a Babylonian perspective. I noticed that Gemini Brett has released a pretty cool astronomical / astrological video on, again, Venus in Leo. As I said, like I think about a month ago, there's just Venus in Leo is just getting so much attention, which she should. She's in Leo. But anyway, he's just given some illustrations around Venus's journey as a morning star, evening star, etc. And if you guys remember, I posted on my own channel a video. Let me see. It was the second last one I did. It's called Venus Morning Star.
Venus and Star Blessings.
Not that one. Yeah, it's second. The second last video I did. It'll be the third last once I post this one. And anyway, it's called Venus Morning Star, Venus Not Invisible. Right? I deliberately named it that because people will think, what do you mean Venus is not invisible? Because there's many times, most of the time she is actually, but the point being that in Melbourne, on the month of August, in Melbourne, she'll just never be invisible. It's just, it's based on latitude. It's an astronomical phenomenon. There are other times when she won't be invisible as well. There was a time there in 2017, and there was an 8-year period there that just included 2017 was one of those years where she was not invisible. It's a little bit complicated to explain in a few words because it's basically astronomy, right? And astronomy, I'm not going to say that I'm an astronomer and astronomy is my strongest point. Absolutely not. I'm just a beginner at astronomy, but I have a basic understanding. The most amazing thing to me is, coming to this knowledge of the fact that Venus just will not be invisible. In a few days' time, when she forms her conjunction to the sun, here in Melbourne, she just will not be invisible. And that's a very powerful omen and spiritual omen, actually. It's an astronomical phenomenon, but it has spiritual implications, I think, and symbolism. And why does that happen in Melbourne and it's not happening everywhere else? It has got to do with latitude and, the position of Venus and the sun and the equator and where Venus is passing and, all these sort of astronomical details and facts. And one might argue that, well, it's just an astronomical thing. It's not a big deal. Well, I beg to differ. I think it is a big deal, and I think it's important. So anyway, I just noticed that what's his name? Gemini Brett was talking about it as well, which is great to see. And Gemini Brett is really great at his astronomy. I think that's one of his specialties, actually. So it's great to see him offering, some free videos around the astronomy of the cycle of Venus and so forth. So I think you can find that online somewhere. If you just looked up his name, Gemini Brett. So anyway, I'll see you guys very, very soon. I hope this was helpful and love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Okay, bye for now.